Should I follow the rules or follow my own instinct? Should I persevere or give up? Should I strike back or forgive? We've all been presented with these questions before in different situations, and sometimes we find an answer and sometimes we don't. However, Malcolm Gladwell in David and Goliath, Underdog, Misfits, and the Art of Battling Giants helps guide us through these questions and find an answer. He uses real-life examples and real-life accounts to challenge the status quo and to be able to overcome. Gladwell takes us to a number of different settings, including basketball courts, Ivy League campuses, and historical as well as biblical battlefields such as the one in David and Goliath. But it doesn't matter where, his running message is the same all throughout, that advantages are weaknesses and disadvantages are strengths. This is where you pause the video and you ask yourself, what? But that's what it says. So once you read chapters 1 through 3, this will make a whole lot more sense. He explores this message, and through different examples, he's able to provide how this message makes sense. So advantages do become weaknesses, and disadvantages become strengths. But above it all is the idea of strength and the idea of effort as well, and the idea that attitude plays a big influence in it. So as long as your attitude is correct, then effort will always overcome ability. So in that case, advantages do become weaknesses and disadvantages do become strengths, which is helpful in many situations when you don't know how to approach a situation. As far as chapters 3 and 6, that's a totally different journey. And so for that one, I'm going to go ahead and pass it to my friend Larry.
Thanks, Heidi. So as we continue the second part of David and Goliath, Gladwell starts laying out what he calls the desirable difficulties. Chapters 4, 5, and 6 lay out things that most of us would think of as disadvantages and difficulties for kids as they grow up. However, for some kids, they turn these difficulties into advantages as they age. Somehow he uses dyslexia, the loss of a parent in childhood, and growing up black in the 50s and 60s as are presented as abstract types of advantages, one you would not expect. So, can dyslexia be a desirable difficulty? A rather large number of entrepreneurs are dyslexic. One study puts the number around a third. Robert Branson, Charles Schwab, and John Chambers are. And my favorite, George S. Patton was. Just to name a few. Do they triumph in spite of their disabilities or because of it? Gladwell questions, if one is not able to use one's sense or skill, meaning reading in this case, did this cause them to enhance other skills? To quote Gladwell, what is learned out of necessity is inevitably more powerful than the learning that comes easily. Gladwell next talks about the difficult lives some live following the loss of a parent. While a rather disproportionate number of people are in prison grew up with only one parent, this difficulty also has made others much more successful. While conventional wisdom says that these kids would not do as well, this difficulty is turned to a strength for others. Gladwell uses Dr. Emil Freiherich, for example, who it's an amazing story, but I'm going to leave that for you so that hopefully you're interested in the book is a little better or a little greater. But I am going to share a couple examples with you that I found extremely interesting. First is that over 60% of British prime ministers lost a parent at a young age. Just as interesting is that almost a quarter of American presidents grew up with only one parent. The third desirable difficulty is having nothing left to lose. Amazingly, he uses Martin Luther King and the African Americans growing up in America in the first half of the 20th century as his example. Martin Luther King grew up as an underdog his whole life. The whole community did. So by the time of the marches in 1965 in Birmingham, it was truly a case of having nothing left to lose. Martin Luther King knew it was now or never. Much like David versus Goliath, Martin Luther King had his whole life grown up the underdog, and now was his chance, and he won. So, as you can see, while they are called desirable difficulties, they may not be desirable, but the difficulties did result in some promising, or in some individuals doing great things. David and Goliath. So, Don, can you go ahead and close this out?
Good afternoon. This is Don Riggins conducting my portion of the book review for David and Goliath, Underdogs, Misfits, and the Art of Battling Giants, Part 3, The Limits of Power, Chapters 7 through 9. Chapter 7, Rosemary Lawler, quote, I wasn't born that way. This was forced upon me, end quote. Rosemary's story takes place in Laurel Fall, Belfast, Northern Ireland in the summer of 1969 between the Catholic and the Protestant people living in that community. Laurel Fall was a predominantly Catholic community, but the people lived under a constant threat of physical danger. The Lawlers would move to the safest place they knew at that time, the nearby Catholic neighborhood of Bella-Murphy in West Belfast. At the beginning of 1970, things got worse in Northern Ireland. A riot would break out in the neighborhood of Bella-Murphy. The British Army was sent in under the command of General Ian Freeland, and General Freeland was a World War II vet who served with distinction in Normandy and later fought insurgency in Cyprus and Zanzibar. He was a man who knew what needed to be done and was not afraid to use force to do it. General Freeland's task was to go into Northern Ireland as a peacekeeper, to be a supporting force for the Bella-Murphy Police Department. But on June 30th, 1970, the British troops received a tip that a cache of weapons was being stored in a house in Laurel Falls. The general would take action. He sent in 5 armored vehicles with troops and police officers to raid the house. After that raid, a riot broke out and lasted about 12 hours. After the riot was over, General Freeland took some government officials and journalists on a tour of the neighborhood to show them that peace was restored. He maintained that he would keep peace by any means necessary. Chapter 8, Wilma Durson. Quote, we have all done some things dreadful in our lives, end quote. Chapter 8 takes place in 1996 with the story of a man named Mike Reynolds and his daughter Kimber. Kimber was home from college to attend a wedding. After that wedding ceremony, she would go to dinner with an old friend. The 2 old friends were getting in a vehicle when 2 men riding on a motorcycle approached them slowly. Kimber was pinned against her car when the gunman grabbed at her purse and pulled out a .357 Magnum handgun and placed it against her head. When she resisted, he fired a shot. Later that day, Kimber would die from a single gunshot wound to the head. Mike, her father, would make a promise to his dying daughter, quote, I can't save your life. I'm going to do everything in my power to prevent this from happening to someone else, end quote. Mike would call a meeting, and he invited community leaders, law enforcement members, judges, the district attorney's office, and the school system. At the conclusion of that meeting, the group had laid the foundation for what we know now as the California 3-strike law. Mike Reynolds and the California 3-strike law would have a 20-year run at stumping out crime in California. End of chapter 8. Chapter 9, Andre Tresemme. Quote, we feel obligated to tell you that there are amongst us a certain number of Jews, end quote. When France fell in June of 1940, the German army allowed the French to set up a government in the city of Vichy. The French government was led by Marshal Philippe Pétain. Pétain was granted full power of a dictator. Pétain collaborated with the Germans and followed their doctrine. He stripped the Jewish people of their rights and pulled them out of their profession. He canceled anti-Semitic laws and rounded up French Jews and put them in internment camps. A local Huguenot pastor, a man named Andre Tresemme, was at home one day when an old Jewish woman arrived at his house because she heard that Les Charbons was a safe place for Jewish people. Tresemme would be known as a Jewish sympathizer in his home city of Vichy. Later in the war, Tresemme would use Les Chavons school as a hiding place for Jewish children. There were 18 pupils attending school at the beginning of the war, and by 1944, the number had rose to 350. It didn't take any great powers of deduction to figure out who those extra 332 children were. Nor did the town make any great secret of what it was doing. Quote, "We feel obligated to tell you that there are amongst us a certain number of Jews." End of chapter 9. David and Goliath is a must-read book for people looking to move into a leadership position.